My name is Eliza Fairchild. I am 33 years old, and 3 months ago my parents taught me exactly how little the word family meant to them. I had traveled nearly 18 hours from Hawaii to North Carolina for my younger sister's wedding. I arrived carrying a carefully wrapped gift, still believing someone would be happy to see me. Instead, my mother stepped in front of the entrance and blocked my path. My father stood beside her without offering so much as a greeting. My mother looked me directly in the eyes and said, "Only family is allowed inside. You were not invited. Leave before you embarrass your sister." I thought I had misunderstood her. I had already paid a $4,200 deposit toward the venue, catering, flowers, and photography. They were expecting me to approve another $38,000 after the reception. Yet when the groom's mother approached and asked who I was, my mother claimed I was connected to the wedding's billing department and had arrived at the wrong time. My father did not correct her. I could have exposed everything right there, but I refused to turn my sister's ceremony into a public argument. I carried my gift back to the rental car and drove away as the wedding began without me. 3 days later, my mother finally called. She did not apologize or ask whether I had returned home safely. Her first question was, "The bill is $38,000. How are you going to pay it?" I laughed and gave her an answer that made her gasp. But to understand that answer, I need to take you back 5 months to the phone call that started everything. 5 months earlier, I was sitting in my Honolulu apartment reviewing a hospital compliance report when my younger sister Phoebe called me on FaceTime. She held her left hand so close to the camera that the diamond ring blurred and shouted that Grant Keaton had proposed during a weekend in the Blue Ridge Mountains. I was genuinely happy for her. Phoebe was 25, 7 years younger than me, and had dreamed about her wedding since childhood. Grant seemed steady and responsible, and he worked in operations for his family's mountain resort company. While Phoebe talked about dresses and flowers, I noticed my mother, Denise, moving around behind her. When I said I would request time off and check flights, Mom leaned into the frame and told me not to make plans yet. She said the wedding would be small and traveling from Hawaii was expensive. I reminded her Phoebe was my only sister. Mom forced a smile and said the guest count wasn't final. Phoebe quickly changed the subject and described the glass conservatory overlooking Mirror Lake, where she wanted to marry. The call ended, but Mom's reaction stayed with me. She hadn't sounded worried about my ticket. She'd sounded worried I might actually attend. A week later, Mom and Dad called together, which usually meant money. My father, Russell, owned a custom woodworking shop outside Pine Haven, North Carolina. He built cabinets and fixtures for expensive vacation homes, but privately I knew the business was struggling. A machine had broken, clients were paying late, and the bank had reduced his credit. Mom began by reminding me how much Phoebe admired me. Dad explained that the venue and vendors required immediate deposits. Grant's family would cover the rehearsal dinner, transportation, and honeymoon, while our family had promised to pay for the ceremony and reception. Dad called it a temporary cash flow problem. Mom said they only needed a reliable third-party payer to secure everything. I asked for the total. After a pause, Dad said $42,200. Mom quickly explained I would only pay the $4,200 deposit and authorize the vendors to request final approval after the wedding. They would handle the remaining $38,000. I asked why Grant's family couldn't use one of their cards. Mom got defensive and said the Keatons were already paying enough. Dad wanted to prove our family could honor its share. Then he mentioned the Keaton resorts were planning to renovate several rental cabins, and his shop might be considered for the cabinetry contract. Suddenly, the wedding wasn't only about Phoebe. It was also about Dad's business, Mom's reputation, and a contract they desperately wanted. I should have refused. I had already covered a property tax shortfall, part of Phoebe's tuition, and replacement equipment for the shop, and each time they thanked me until the money arrived. Still, I didn't want Phoebe to lose her venue because I was tired of being the responsible one. I agreed to review the documents. I worked as a senior healthcare compliance auditor, so I read every line. The event hosts listed were Russell Fairchild, Denise Fairchild, Phoebe Fairchild, and Grant Keaton. My name appeared only on a separate third-party payment authorization. It allowed me to pay the deposit and required my written approval before the final balance could be charged. If I declined, the event hosts remained responsible. I highlighted that section and emailed it to my parents. Mom said it was standard language and would never matter. I signed and paid the deposit. Mom called me her lifesaver. Phoebe sent heart emojis and wrote, "Best sister ever." Being erased, one small cut at a time. 2 days later, Phoebe created a wedding planning group chat. I only learned about it when she accidentally sent me a screenshot. I hadn't been included. She said the chat was for people living nearby, and the time difference made my involvement inconvenient. A month passed without an invitation. Phoebe laughed when I asked whether she had my address and said immediate family didn't need formal invitations. Then Mom asked me not to post anything about the wedding because Grant's family valued privacy, even as Phoebe kept posting dress fittings, cake samples, and venue tour. Whenever the Keatons appeared, my parents acted as if they were funding everything. Mom wrote that she and Dad were giving their daughter the wedding of her dreams. Dad posted that years of hard work had made it possible. Neither mentioned me. 2 weeks before the wedding, I still had no invitation or schedule. Phoebe insisted I was automatically included because I was her sister, told me to wear navy or dark green, and said the ceremony began at 2. When I asked about the rehearsal dinner, she called it a gathering for the wedding party and immediate local family. The phrase made no sense, but I let it go. I requested 5 days of leave and booked flights from Honolulu through Los Angeles and Atlanta to Asheville, with layovers, nearly 18 hours. I reserved a rental car and hotel, and bought Phoebe and Grant a set of leather luggage for their honeymoon. 3 days before my flight, Phoebe posted photos from the rehearsal dinner, standing between Mom and Lorraine Keaton beneath a banner reading, "Two families becoming one." The caption said she was surrounded by everyone who had carried her to that moment. I had paid the deposit that secured the wedding, yet I wasn't part of the family she credited. I texted Phoebe. 4 hours later, she said the dinner had become a last-minute gathering, and there hadn't been time to tell me. I was still in Hawaii, so the excuse made no sense. The night before I left, Mom told me not to come to the house after landing. Everyone would be exhausted, the rooms filled with decorations. I should arrive at the venue close to the ceremony. There was no reason to come early. I asked if Phoebe needed help getting ready. Mom answered too quickly that the bridal room would be crowded. I told myself wedding stress explained everything. I drafted a short toast about how Phoebe used to practice weddings in our backyard when she was 8. Somewhere over the Pacific, I read it quietly and smiled, still believing I'd deliver it at the reception. The day of the wedding. After landing, I texted Mom, Dad, and Phoebe. Dad didn't answer. Phoebe sent a thumbs up. Mom replied nearly an hour later with 3 words, "Ceremony at 2. No one asked about the flight or invited me to dinner. At the hotel, I called Phoebe. She let it go to voicemail. I left a cheerful message telling her I loved her. She never called back. The next afternoon, I arrived at Mirror Lake Conservatory 20 minutes before the ceremony. At the check-in table, the attendant searched the printed list and tablet, then asked whether I might be listed under another name. I said I was the bride's sister. Her smile disappeared, and she contacted the family. Mom and Dad appeared less than 2 minutes later. Mom wore a silver-blue dress, Dad a dark suit. Neither smiled. Mom stopped in front of me and asked what I was doing there. I laughed because the question seemed absurd. I said I was there for Phoebe's wedding. Mom glanced toward the guests, lowered her voice, and said, "Only family is allowed inside. You are not invited. Leave." I looked at Dad, waiting for him to stop her. Instead, he told me I should have understood the situation and not embarrassed Phoebe. I asked what situation he meant. Mom said it wasn't the time to discuss family problems. I reminded her she'd called me a lifesaver when she needed the deposit. "Was I family when you needed my card?" I asked. She told me to lower my voice. Lorraine Keaton approached in an elegant cream dress and asked if everything was all right. For 1 second, I expected Mom to introduce me. Instead, she smiled and said I was connected to the wedding planner's billing department and had arrived at the wrong time to discuss an invoice. Lorraine looked confused. She thought the finances were settled. Mom laughed nervously and called it a minor administrative issue. Dad let the lie stand. I could have told Lorraine I was their eldest daughter, that I'd traveled nearly 18 hours, and that the deposit had come from me. Then I saw Phoebe inside the glass hallway in her wedding dress. Our eyes met. She didn't look surprised to see me outside. She looked frightened. She didn't move or call my name. She turned away. That was when I understood. She knew. I told my parents I'd heard their decision clearly, then walked back to the rental car carrying my gift. Mom called after me not to be dramatic. I sat behind the wheel, unable to start the engine. I had believed that if I kept showing up and solving their problems, they would eventually treat me like I belonged. Instead, they'd accepted my money and erased me. I deleted the toast from my phone. Then my professional instincts took over. I recorded the time, location, exact words, and names of witnesses, and emailed the notes to myself for a timestamp. As the ceremony music began, a notification appeared from the venue. Final payment reconciliation available. Approval required by Monday at noon. The invoice was $38,000, with two options: approve payment or decline authorization. I looked at the conservatory where my family was celebrating without me, then at the word decline. For the first time that day, I felt clarity. Declining. Back at the hotel, I opened my laptop and downloaded every wedding agreement. I didn't want anger making the decision. I wanted the documents to tell me what I could legally do. The venue, catering, florist, and photography contracts all listed my parents, Phoebe, and Grant as the event hosts. My authorization was separate. I had paid a non-refundable $4,200 deposit and agreed the vendors could request my approval for the final balance. No payment could be processed without my written confirmation. If I declined, the hosts remained responsible. I wasn't canceling services or asking the vendors to absorb a loss, only refusing to volunteer another $38,000. That evening, Phoebe left a voicemail saying the ceremony had been beautiful and the reception was going perfectly, then apologized that things had gotten awkward outside. She claimed Mom panicked because the Keatons had been told I wasn't attending. She didn't ask where I was or whether I was all right. Her voice warmed only when she reminded me to approve the final invoice, thanking me for making her dream day possible, and calling me the best sister anyone could ask for. I listened twice. The second time I understood, I was the best sister when I solved problems, paid bills, and accepted disrespect quietly. Around 9, Aunt Nadine called Dad's older sister, a retired mediation attorney who'd attended the wedding and noticed I was missing. She told me Mom had given a speech about how she and Dad had sacrificed for years to give Phoebe the perfect celebration, and Dad had thanked the Keatons for trusting the Fairchild family. Knowing the shop was struggling, the speech confused her. When I told her what happened, she asked whose names were on the contracts and whether my authorization required final approval, then said, "Do exactly what the documents allow. Keep your records and let the adults who signed remain responsible." Her advice settled me. Calmness didn't have to mean surrender. On Sunday morning, 4 invoices arrived. The venue for $16,000, the caterer for $12,500, the florist for $5,700, and the photographer for $3,800. I called each vendor and confirmed that declining would redirect the balance to the event hosts. No vendor would lose money, and the hosts would have 5 business days to arrange payment. I requested written confirmation, then clicked Decline Authorization on each invoice, stating plainly that I hadn't attended or received the contracted services and wouldn't provide voluntary payment. I saved every confirmation with the contracts and changed my flight to Monday morning. Before leaving, I packed Phoebe's gift back into my suitcase. Mailing it would have been another way of pretending nothing happened. At the airport, Mom texted, "Hope you've had time to calm down. We'll discuss this after the honeymoon." I didn't answer. On the flight, I slept for hours and woke over the Pacific feeling something unfamiliar: relief. The bill comes due. Mom called at 9, 14 Tuesday morning, 3 days after the wedding. Her voice was soft and cheerful. She asked whether I'd arrived home safely and hoped I'd rested, the first time anyone in my immediate family had asked about my trip. Then she said weddings were emotional, and the incident at the entrance had been an unfortunate misunderstanding. I asked which part she'd misunderstood, that I was her daughter or that I'd traveled across the country. Her tone changed. She said this wasn't the time to reopen the argument. Then she got to the real reason for the call. The vendors had contacted her. My authorization had been declined, and the remaining $38,000 had been redirected to the event hosts. She asked how I planned to pay it. I laughed because she sounded genuinely confused, as if my money still belonged to her after she denied I belonged to the family. Then I gave her the answer that made her gasp. "You said only family was allowed inside, Mom, so the family inside can pay for it." The line went silent. Then she accused me of being childish and creating a financial crisis over one uncomfortable conversation. I reminded her she hadn't called me her daughter in front of Lorraine. She said she was preventing a scene because the Keatons had been given a simplified explanation about our family. I asked what that meant. She admitted she'd told them I'd been estranged for years and refused to participate in the wedding. I asked why she lied. She said the Keatons valued close families, Dad needed their business, and she didn't want complications damaging Phoebe's future. I told her she wanted my money but not my presence because I contradicted the image she'd sold. Her voice sharpened. She reminded me she'd raised me and paid for my education, and that Dad's shop might fail if he lost the resort contract. I told her his business decisions weren't my responsibility. She said Phoebe and Grant couldn't begin marriage with $38,000 in debt. I reminded her 4 adults had signed the contracts. She warned the vendors might damage Dad's reputation. I said reputation wasn't something I could buy for him. Then she said I was the older sister and should be mature. I told her maturity didn't mean paying people to disrespect me. She threatened to tell everyone I'd abandoned the family over money. I told her to include the part where she'd accepted my deposit and thrown me out. She said I was destroying the family. I said I'd only stopped financing the version of it that excluded me. She hung up. Phoebe called 20 minutes later, already crying. Grant had received the invoices and wanted to know why my payment had been withdrawn. He hadn't known I'd provided the deposit or was expected to cover the balance. Phoebe begged me to approve the payment before his parents learned everything. I asked if she'd known Mom planned to keep me outside. She said Mom told her it would be easier if I didn't enter the venue, but claimed she hadn't known Dad would speak to me that way. I reminded her she'd seen me through the glass and turned away. She said she'd been moments from walking down the aisle and didn't know what to do. I told her she'd made a choice. She chose the ceremony, the image, and the money over acknowledging me. Then she asked if I could pay half. Even mid-apology, she was calculating how much she might recover. I said I'd discuss our relationship when she was ready to talk without mentioning an invoice. Dad called that afternoon, saying the vendors were demanding a plan and the situation was affecting his health. I asked why he'd signed contracts he couldn't afford. He said he believed I understood family responsibility. I asked if that included standing silently while Mom called me a billing employee. He admitted the Keaton resort contract could have been worth several $100,000. Mom feared that revealing family conflict would make the Fairchilds look unreliable. I told him hiding his daughter and lying about the wedding money was what made him unreliable. He accused me of letting his business collapse to prove a point. I asked if he'd ever planned to repay the $38,000. He said the resort contract would eventually provide enough income. They'd expected me to carry the debt until he benefited from the lie. That evening, I emailed Mom, Dad, Phoebe, and Grant, attaching the contracts and confirmations showing the hosts were responsible. I stated I wouldn't authorize payment, asked that all financial communication remain in writing, and said any future relationship with me would require a specific acknowledgement of what happened, without excuses, guilt, or requests for money. The truth comes out. An hour later, Aunt Nadine called. Lorraine Keaton had contacted her, wanting to know who the woman outside the venue truly was. Nadine called me before answering. I told her she could share the truth, nothing exaggerated. Nadine explained I was Russell and Denise's eldest daughter, that I'd traveled nearly 18 hours, paid the deposit, been expected to approve another $38,000, and been stopped at the entrance and presented as someone from billing. Lorraine kept asking why my parents would do that. Nadine said she'd have to ask them, adding only that I'd shown more restraint leaving quietly than most people would have. Lorraine requested a meeting with my parents, Phoebe, Grant, and her husband. Grant later told me what happened. Lorraine laid the contracts and invoices on the table and asked Mom who'd paid the deposit. Mom tried to say the money came from the family collectively. Grant corrected her. The receipt listed my card. Lorraine asked Dad why he'd claimed business savings were paying for the reception. Dad said he'd expected to reimburse me after securing new work. Lorraine asked if he meant the renovation contract from their resorts. He admitted it. She told him their company couldn't award a major contract to someone who'd begun the relationship with false financial information. Dad argued his craftsmanship had nothing to do with a private family conflict. Lorraine said honesty and financial reliability weren't private when evaluating a contractor. His shop was removed from consideration. Mom blamed me for refusing to cooperate. Lorraine asked how I could cooperate with a wedding I'd been forbidden to attend. Mom claimed I'd been estranged for years. Phoebe finally admitted I'd continued helping the family and supporting her education. Grant asked why she'd never told him. She said she was ashamed of how dependent they'd become on me. He asked why the solution was taking more money while pretending I didn't exist. She had no answer. Lorraine made clear the Keatons would not pay the $38,000. They'd already covered their agreed expenses, and paying the Fairchilds' share would reward deception. Grant agreed. Consequences. Grant and Phoebe canceled their honeymoon, used the refunds and much of their wedding gift money to pay part of the vendors, and took a personal loan for the balance, which Grant insisted remain in both their names since both had signed the contracts. Phoebe increased her hours at the design studio and later took a full-time position. Grant asked for financial counseling because he no longer trusted her to disclose important information. They stayed married, but their beginning was nothing like the effortless future Phoebe had imagined. Dad faced consequences, too. Without the resort opportunity, he could no longer pretend a future contract would solve the shop's problems. He sold an old fishing boat to make the first large vendor payment, delayed buying equipment, and negotiated a structured plan. He had to admit to his employees that the company had expanded too quickly on expected income that never came. Mom's consequences were mostly social. For years, she'd built an identity around charity events, fundraisers, and being a devoted mother. Lorraine served with her on an annual hospital gala committee. After learning the truth, Lorraine withdrew from their joint role, saying she couldn't manage donations with someone whose financial claims she no longer trusted. Pinehaven was small, and questions followed. Mom called it a misunderstanding involving an estranged daughter, but relatives confirmed I'd continued supporting the family. Aunt Nadine refused to cover for her. When Mom accused her of destroying the family's reputation, Nadine said she'd only stopped protecting a lie. Within a month, Mom resigned from the committee. She wasn't publicly run out of town, but people who'd once accepted every version of her story began asking questions. Her image no longer controlled the room. 2 apologies, and one that never came. 2 weeks after the wedding, Phoebe sent a long message apologizing for the canceled honeymoon, Grant's anger, and the loan, then asked whether I could cover one payment until her salary increased. She was still apologizing for the consequences, not for what she'd done to me. I refused and said I'd listen when she was ready to acknowledge her choice at the venue. A month later, Dad emailed me with the subject line, "No excuse." He admitted he'd known Mom planned to keep me outside and had gone along with it because he feared losing the Keaton contract. He wrote that he'd chosen a possible business opportunity over his daughter and had no justification. He said he'd repay the $4,200 deposit in 12 monthly payments. He didn't ask for forgiveness or mention his health. The next morning, $350 appeared in my account with the note, payment 1 of 12. It didn't repair the relationship, but it was the first apology that included responsibility instead of a demand. Mom also messaged me, sorry, everything had been misunderstood. And could I tell Lorraine the wedding dispute had nothing to do with Dad's business? She wanted my forgiveness only to restore what she'd lost. I didn't answer. Silence was no longer something they used to erase me. It was something I chose to protect myself. 6 months later, my life in Honolulu looked ordinary from the outside. Same job, same reports, same routines, but I'd changed how I lived outside work. For years, I'd accepted extra assignments, answered family calls during meetings, and solved emergencies before asking whether they belonged to me. After the wedding, I started therapy. My therapist described my pattern as functional overresponsibility. I measured my worth by how useful I was. When my family had a problem, I believed love required me to fix it. If they ignored me, I tried harder. If they needed money, I treated my savings like a resource they could claim. Therapy didn't teach me to hate them. It taught me to separate compassion from obligation. I could care about Dad without financing his shop. I could love Phoebe without protecting her from consequences. I could understand Mom's fear of judgment without letting it decide my place in the family. I created 4 financial rules for myself. Never co-sign a family loan. Any money I give is clearly a gift or a documented loan. I won't provide a credit card for an event I don't control. And I wait at least 72 hours before agreeing to any major request. They weren't punishment. They gave me time to think before guilt could answer for me. I also shared some of these principles during financial wellness workshops at work, without ever naming my family, explaining third-party payment agreements, legal responsibility, and the importance of written records. Coworkers later told me they'd reconsidered co-signing loans or sharing credit cards with relatives. Turning my humiliation into something useful gave the experience meaning. I stopped spending free weekends waiting for family emergencies. I joined an outrigger canoe club and started paddling twice a week. I returned the wedding gift and used part of the refund for hiking equipment. I spent time with friends who invited me because they wanted my company, not my credit limit. Dad kept sending $350 every month and never missed a payment. His emails became more honest. He told me when the shop lost a client without asking me to replace the income, and started working with a small business advisor. After the 6th payment, he wrote that he finally understood how often he'd treated my competence as permission to place more weight on me. I didn't forgive him immediately. Consistency mattered more than one thoughtful sentence. Still, I answered some emails. The door between us wasn't open, but it was no longer sealed shut. Phoebe reached out again nearly 5 months after the wedding, with a shorter message. She admitted she'd known Mom planned to keep me outside and stayed silent because she feared losing the wedding and the Keatons' approval. She acknowledged seeing me through the glass and turning away, and admitted she'd let me fund a celebration where I might not even be welcome. There was no request for money this time. No blame, no demand that I speak to Grant, just an understanding if I never trusted her again. That was the first apology that actually named the wound. I agreed to one phone call. I told her rebuilding our relationship would take time, honesty, and no financial dependence. She accepted. We now talk for about 30 minutes once a month. The calls are sometimes uncomfortable, but at least we don't pretend anymore. Grant and Phoebe are still married, still in counseling, still paying off the loan. Their marriage began with a crack, but cracks can show you where reinforcement is needed. Whether they succeed will depend on what they build from the truth, not how their photographs look. Mom has never offered a real apology. She still calls the wedding a misunderstanding and tells relatives I overreacted. The difference is that I no longer chase her approval or argue with her version of events. I sent one final email saying I'd consider limited contact only after she acknowledged 3 facts. That she told the Keatons I was estranged when I wasn't, that she accepted my money while planning to exclude me, and that she denied my identity to protect her image. Until she could state those facts without changing the subject, I wouldn't resume the relationship. She never answered. What I learned. I used to believe a boundary failed if the other person refused to understand it. Now I know understanding isn't required. A boundary isn't an argument you have to win. It's information about what you will allow and what happens when the limit is crossed. That was the most valuable education the wedding gave me. Family love should never require one person to become the permanent provider, rescuer, mediator, and silent witness. Helping can be generous, but repeatedly shielding people from consequences can keep them from ever becoming responsible. A real apology has to name the behavior, recognize the harm, and include some effort to repair it. Dad's repayments didn't erase what happened, but they showed accountability. Phoebe's second apology didn't restore trust, but it created a place where trust could start to grow. Mom's refusal taught me that reconciliation can't be built by one person alone. I didn't win because my parents had to find $38,000 or because Dad lost a contract. Those outcomes belong to their own choices. My victory was simpler. I stopped paying for a place in a family that welcomed my resources but not me. I didn't interrupt the wedding, spread rumors, damage property, or manipulate any contract. I followed the agreement, told the truth, and let 4 adults pay for the celebration they had planned. For years, I thought being a good daughter meant absorbing every cost without complaint. Now I understand that self-respect isn't cruelty, and saying no isn't abandonment. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop rescuing people from the lessons their own behavior has created. Real family isn't defined by who shares your last name or who calls when an invoice arrives. It's defined by honesty, respect, accountability, and whether someone still makes room for you when you have nothing to offer except yourself. This story is a work of fiction, created for entertainment and storytelling purposes.